Imagine you are diving off the coast of Peru. The water is cold, dark. Visibility drops to almost nothing below 30 meters. And then your hand brushes against something on the seafloor. Something enormous. Something serrated. A tooth. Not from any shark alive today. This tooth is the size of your hand. Wider than your palm, heavier than a brick. You bring it to the surface. And the moment marine paleontologist Kenshu Shimada holds it under the light, he knows exactly what he is looking at. Otodus Megalodon, the largest predatory fish that ever existed on this planet. And this tooth, according to radiometric dating, is approximately 3.6 million years old. That moment captures everything that makes Megalodon one of the most haunting mysteries in all of natural history. Because this creature was not a myth. It was not a legend invented by ancient sailors to explain the unknown. It was real. It was physical. It left behind evidence so massive, so undeniable, that scientists have spent over a century trying to reconstruct its life and its death. But here is the question that keeps paleontologists awake at night. How does the most powerful predator the ocean has ever produced simply disappear? Not from an asteroid, not from a volcanic catastrophe, not from some sudden dramatic apocalypse that rewrote the planet in fire and ash. The Megalodon vanished during a period when the Earth was still teeming with life. The oceans were full. The ecosystems were complex. And yet, something killed the apex of all apexes. Something ended the reign of a creature that could swallow a great white shark whole. Today, we are going to investigate that extinction, not as a simple fact from a textbook, not as a line in a museum display that reads, "Extinct approximately 3.6 million years ago." We are going to follow the evidence. We are going to look at the fossil record, the oceanographic data, the climate science, and the biological research to reconstruct, hour by hour in geological terms, the last chapter of the Megalodon's story. Think of it as a crime scene investigation. The victim is the most fearsome animal that ever swam in any ocean. The crime took place over thousands of years, and the suspects are many. But before we get to the death, we need to understand the life. Because you cannot truly grasp the scale of this extinction without first understanding what exactly was lost. Otodus Megalodon, the name comes from the ancient Greek words for giant tooth, first appears in the fossil record approximately 23 million years ago, during a period geologists call the early Miocene epoch. From the very beginning, it was extraordinary. Its teeth alone tell the story. The largest Megalodon tooth ever formally measured and cataloged, housed in the collection of the Calvert Marine Museum in Maryland, reaches 18.5 centimeters in height. To put that in perspective, the largest tooth of a modern great white shark rarely exceeds 7 centimeters. We are talking about a tooth nearly 3 times larger. A tooth built not just to bite, but to destroy. For most of the 20th century, scientists estimated Megalodon's size by scaling up from those teeth, comparing their proportions to modern great white sharks. Those early estimates placed Megalodon at somewhere between 12 and 25 meters in length. A massive range reflecting how little we actually knew. Because here is the fundamental problem with studying Megalodon. Sharks have cartilaginous skeletons. Cartilage does not fossilize the way bone does. So what we have, almost entirely, are teeth. Thousands of them found on every ocean floor on the planet. but almost no complete skeletal remains. In 2022, a landmark study published in the journal Science Advances by paleontologist Catalina Pimiento and her colleagues at Swansea University used a newly developed geometric morphometric model to produce the most precise body length estimate to date. Their conclusion: Megalodon likely reached a maximum length of approximately 15 to 16 meters, with a body mass potentially exceeding 50 metric tons. Not the monster of Hollywood fantasy, but something arguably more terrifying. A real biological evolved killing machine of almost incomprehensible size. And it dominated the oceans for nearly 20 million years. 20 million years. To understand what that means, modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for approximately 300,000 years. The Megalodon ruled the oceans for 66 times longer than our entire species has existed. It survived climate fluctuations, sea level changes, the rise and fall of countless prey species. It adapted. It persisted. It conquered every ocean basin on the planet, from the warm, shallow waters of what is now the Caribbean to the deep, cold waters of the southern Pacific. And then, in geological terms, almost overnight, it was gone. The official scientific consensus, based on the most thorough analysis of the global Megalodon fossil record, places the extinction at approximately 3.6 million years ago, during the Pliocene epoch. This date comes from a comprehensive 2019 study by Pimiento and her colleagues, published in the journal PLOS, which analyzed over 300 Megalodon fossil occurrences from around the world and mapped their distribution through time. The youngest confirmed Megalodon fossils cluster around that 3.6 million year mark. But here is where the mystery deepens. That date is not a moment. It is not a single catastrophe. It is the end of a process, a long, grinding decline that began millions of years earlier and culminated in total extinction. And tracing that decline means looking at everything that was changing in the world's oceans at exactly that time. The climate was shifting, the oceans were cooling, the prey was changing, new predators were rising, and Megalodon, for all its evolutionary perfection, found itself caught in a convergence of forces it could not overcome. This is the story of those final years, the last chapter of a 20 million year dynasty, the last hunt, the last breath, the last tooth to sink into the seafloor. This is the last 24 hours of the Megalodon. The world that was. Megalodon's empire at its peak. To understand what Megalodon lost, you have to understand what it once had. Close your eyes for a moment. Transport yourself back 15 million years. The Miocene epoch is at its peak. The planet is warmer than today, significantly warmer. Global average temperatures run roughly 3 to 4 degrees Celsius higher than the modern baseline. The polar ice caps are smaller, sea levels are higher, and the oceans are a different world entirely. The Atlantic and Pacific are connected through a seaway that no longer exists. The Central American Seaway, a broad, warm, shallow corridor of water running between North and South America, allows tropical currents to flow freely between the two great ocean basins. The Gulf Stream as we know it today does not yet exist in its modern form. Ocean circulation patterns are fundamentally different, and in those warm, nutrient-rich, interconnected waters, Megalodon reigns absolutely. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is what the fossil record tells us. Megalodon teeth have been recovered from every major ocean basin on Earth. from the Chesapeake Bay Formation in Maryland to the Bone Valley Formation in Florida, from the Miocene deposits of Morocco and Spain to the fossil beds of southern Australia, from the deep-sea sediments of the Pacific to the ancient reef systems preserved in the rock of what is now landlocked Peru. The geographic distribution of Megalodon fossils is one of the most comprehensive of any large marine predator in the entire fossil record. What does that distribution tell us? It tells us that Megalodon was a cosmopolitan species, a global predator. It was not confined to a single ocean, a single temperature zone, a single prey community. It was everywhere, and it fed on everything large enough to be worth pursuing. The fossil record of Megalodon's prey is almost as dramatic as Megalodon itself. During the Miocene, the oceans were full of large whales. Not the giants we know today, blue whales, fin whales, sperm whales, but their predecessors and relatives. Cetatherid whales, small to medium-sized baleen whales ranging from 3 to 9 meters in length. Squalodon, a now extinct group of toothed whales with shark-like teeth, early relatives of modern dolphins and porpoises, and massive sirenians, dugong relatives the size of small boats, grazing on underwater seagrass beds in the warm coastal shallows. These were Megalodon's primary prey, and we know this not from inference or guesswork. We know it from the most direct evidence possible. Fossil whale bones from multiple species recovered at multiple sites across multiple continents, bearing the unmistakable signature of Megalodon bite marks. In 2010, a team led by paleontologist Mace Brown at the Mace Brown Museum of Natural History in South Carolina documented a series of fossilized whale vertebrae from the Miocene deposits of the Lee Creek Mine in North Carolina. These vertebrae showed deep parallel gouges, the width and spacing of the grooves precisely matching Megalodon tooth serrations. The cuts were not random. They were concentrated on the flanks and tail section of the whale skeleton, exactly where a large shark would attack to disable prey and prevent escape. This was not scavenging. This was predation, calculated, strategic, and executed with brutal efficiency. Other sites tell the same story. Fossil beds in Tuscany, Italy, excavated through the 1990s and 2000s by researchers from the University of Pisa, yielded whale bones with bite marks so deep they penetrated entirely through the bone. The force required to produce such marks has been estimated by biomechanical researchers at values exceeding 108,000 newtons. To put that in comprehensible terms, that is roughly 10 times the bite force of a modern great white shark and approaching 3 times the estimated bite force of Tyrannosaurus rex. Megalodon did not just bite, it obliterated. And for millions of years, this system worked perfectly. The warm oceans produced abundant prey. The prey populations supported the apex predator. The apex predator kept the ecosystem in balance, culling the weak and the slow, shaping the evolutionary trajectory of the whale lineages it hunted. This is what ecologists call a top-down trophic cascade, a situation where the apex predator structures the entire food web beneath it. But ecosystems are not permanent. They are dynamic. They shift. They respond to forces far larger than any single species, even a species as dominant as Megalodon. And around 5 million years ago, those forces began to move. Slowly at first, imperceptibly from the perspective of any individual Megalodon swimming in the warm Miocene seas, but in the language of geology, in the record written in ocean sediments and ice cores and fossil distributions, the signs were unmistakable. The world was beginning to change. The first and most critical change was tectonic. The slow, grinding movement of the North and South American tectonic plates was gradually closing the Central American Seaway. This was not a sudden event. It happened over millions of years, a progressive narrowing and shallowing of the corridor that connected the Atlantic and Pacific. But the consequences, once that connection was severed, were profound beyond any simple description. The closure of the Central American Seaway, now dated by geologists to approximately 2.8 million years ago, though significant restriction began earlier, around 4 million years ago, fundamentally reorganized global ocean circulation. The warm tropical current that had previously flowed between the oceans was cut off. The Gulf Stream intensified in its modern form. Cold water from the north began to penetrate deeper and farther south. The Atlantic and Pacific became thermally and chemically distinct ocean systems for the first time in tens of millions of years. And with that reorganization came cooling. Dramatic, sustained, geological scale cooling. The evidence is written in ocean sediment cores, cylindrical samples drilled from the deep seafloor that preserve a chemical record of ancient ocean temperatures in the ratios of oxygen isotopes trapped in microscopic shell-forming organisms called foraminifera. These sediment cores, analyzed by oceanographers at institutions including the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in California and the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany, show a clear and dramatic cooling trend beginning in the late Miocene and accelerating through the Pliocene, precisely the period when Megalodon's fossil record begins to thin and eventually disappear. The oceans that had supported Megalodon's empire for 20 million years were transforming into something colder, more stratified, more challenging, something Megalodon had never encountered before in its entire evolutionary history. And the prey was changing too. This is the second great force bearing down on Megalodon during its final millions of years. As the oceans cooled, the warm water coastal environments that had supported the dense populations of cetathorid whales began to contract. Many of these smaller whale species, the bread and butter of Megalodon's diet, were themselves declining toward extinction during the Pliocene. According to a 2016 study by Pimento and colleagues published in the Royal Society Open Science Journal, at least a third of all large marine mammal species present during the Miocene had gone extinct by the time Megalodon itself disappeared. Megalodon was not just losing its ocean, it was losing its food supply. But there was one more factor, one more element in this convergence of catastrophe, one that makes the Megalodon story not just a tale of environmental change, but something closer to ecological displacement. A new predator was rising, and it would prove to be everything Megalodon was not. The rise of the rival. Orcas, great whites, and the new order. There is a moment in every great dynasty when the first crack appears. Not a collapse, not a catastrophe, just a hairline fracture, barely visible, easy to dismiss. But in hindsight, looking back across millions of years of fossil evidence, that crack is unmistakable. For Megalodon, that crack had a name. Several names, actually, because while the climate was cooling and the prey was thinning, the Pliocene oceans were simultaneously producing something new, something leaner, something faster, something built not for the warm, prey-rich shallows of the Miocene, but for the colder, more dynamic, more challenging world that was emerging. The fossil record of the late Miocene and early Pliocene documents a remarkable diversification of marine predators, and two lineages in particular deserve our full attention, because these two groups did not merely survive the transition that killed Megalodon, they thrived in it. They exploited it, and there is a compelling scientific argument that they actively accelerated Megalodon's decline. The first is the great white shark, Carcharodon carcharias. The evolutionary relationship between Megalodon and the great white shark was, for decades, one of the most contentious debates in all of paleontology. For most of the 20th century, the dominant hypothesis was that the great white shark was a direct descendant of Megalodon, a smaller, cold-adapted evolutionary offshoot that inherited the apex predator role as its ancestor declined. This hypothesis was intuitive. Both are large mackerel sharks. Both have serrated teeth. Both are apex predators specializing in marine mammals. The lineage seemed obvious. It was wrong. A series of molecular and morphological studies conducted through the 2000s and into the 2010s dismantled the Megalodon to great white hypothesis entirely. The most comprehensive of these, a 2012 study by Dana Arrett and colleagues at Rutgers University, published in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, demonstrated that the great white shark descends not from Otodus Megalodon, but from a separate lineage. The two sharks are evolutionary cousins at best. Convergent evolution, the process by which unrelated species independently develop similar traits in response to similar ecological pressures, had simply produced two superficially similar predators from entirely different ancestral lines. And here is where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. The great white shark appears in the fossil record at approximately 6.2 million years ago, during the late Miocene, precisely the period when Megalodon's global distribution was beginning to contract, precisely when the ocean temperatures were beginning to Precisely when the prey communities were beginning to shift toward the smaller, faster, more cold-adapted marine mammals that would come to dominate the Pliocene oceans. Was this coincidence? Or was Megalodon's decline creating the ecological space into which the great white shark expanded? Paleontologist Catalina Pimiento addressed this question directly in her 2016 analysis. Her data suggested something striking. As Megalodon's fossil occurrences declined in certain geographic regions, particularly in the higher latitudes where ocean cooling was most pronounced, great white shark fossil occurrences increased in precisely those same regions. The two species showed what ecologists call competitive exclusion dynamics, not necessarily direct confrontation. Not Megalodon and great white circling each other in some ancient gladiatorial combat, but a slow, inexorable ecological replacement, one predator filling the niche vacated by another. The great white was better suited to the new ocean. Smaller body mass meant lower caloric requirements. A more flexible thermal tolerance allowed it to hunt in the colder waters that were becoming dominant. And its prey, seals, sea lions, smaller cetaceans, were precisely the animals proliferating in the cooling Pliocene seas. But the great white shark, for all its formidable qualities, was not the only new predator reshaping the Pliocene ocean. The second lineage is, in some ways, even more remarkable. The ancestors of modern killer whales, or Orcinus orca, were present in the Pliocene oceans. The fossil record of early orca relatives is incomplete, as it is for most cetaceans, but molecular clock analyses, genetic studies that use mutation rates to estimate evolutionary divergence times, place the origin of the Orcinus lineage at approximately 10 to 11 million years ago. By the Pliocene, orca relatives were established components of the ocean's predator community. And killer whales represent something Megalodon almost certainly never encountered before in its 20 million year history. Something categorically different from any previous competitor or prey. A cooperative hunter. Modern killer whales hunt in coordinated ponds. They communicate with sophisticated vocalizations. They develop and transmit hunting strategies culturally, passing learned behaviors from generation to generation. Different pods specialize in different prey, some targeting fish, others specializing exclusively in marine mammals, developing specific techniques for hunting everything from herring to blue whales. The fossil record cannot directly preserve hunting behavior. We cannot watch Pliocene orca relatives coordinate an attack, but the anatomical and neurological evidence is clear. The brain-to-body ratio of orca relatives was increasing through the Miocene and Pliocene, a reliable proxy for cognitive complexity. The social structures evidenced by pod bonding behaviors in modern orcas are ancient traits, not recent innovations. Now consider the implications for Megalodon. A solitary predator, even one of Megalodon's size, hunting in a world where cooperative predators are increasingly common, faces a fundamentally different competitive landscape. Not because killer whales could kill an adult Megalodon, almost certainly they could not, but because cooperative hunters can exploit prey more efficiently. They can target the same whale calves and juvenile cetaceans that a solitary Megalodon depends on. They can drive prey away from areas where Megalodon hunts. They can, in the language of ecology, outcompete a solitary apex predator for the same limited food resources. There is direct modern evidence for this today in certain regions where great white shark and killer whale populations overlap, particularly around the Farallon Islands off California and the waters of South Africa. Researchers have documented killer whale pods actively displacing great white sharks from feeding areas. A 2019 study published in Scientific Reports by Alison Towner and colleagues at the Dyer Island Conservation Trust documented great white sharks abandoning feeding sites for periods of up to a year following killer whale presence. The sharks were not killed. They were simply outcompeted, behaviorally excluded. If modern killer whales can displace modern great white sharks, animals that can reach 6 meters in length and represent the apex of today's ocean food web, what might Pliocene orca relatives have done to juvenile or weakened megatoothed sharks competing for the same declining prey base? We cannot answer that question with certainty. The fossil record does not preserve behavioral interactions with that level of resolution, but the ecological logic is sound, and it represents one of the most intriguing threads in the entire Megalodon extinction puzzle. There is a third competitor worth mentioning, one less dramatic than killer whales, but potentially just as consequential in the long arithmetic of caloric competition. Sperm whales, Physeter macrocephalus. Modern sperm whales are the largest toothed predators on Earth. Their lineage extends deep into the Miocene, and unlike Megalodon, which hunted in the upper water column and coastal environments where whale prey was concentrated, sperm whales are deep divers, capable of descending to depths of over 2,000 meters in pursuit of giant squid and other deep-sea prey. Through the Pliocene, as surface ocean temperatures dropped and prey distribution shifted, sperm whales and their relatives may have been accessing food resources entirely beyond Megalodon's reach. Not direct competition, but another fragment of the food web gradually becoming unavailable to the apex predator that had dominated it for 20 million years. Think about what was happening in the Pliocene Ocean from Megalodon's perspective, if we can use that word for an animal whose cognitive experience we can only dimly imagine. The warm shallows where prey was once abundant were cooling and shrinking. The large, slow cetotharid whales that had been Megalodon's primary prey for millions of years were themselves declining toward extinction. New predators, smaller, more flexible, in some cases socially coordinated, were filling the ecological space. And Megalodon itself, with its enormous body mass, its voracious caloric requirements, its apparent dependence on warm coastal waters for reproduction, was caught in a trap of its own evolutionary success. It had been optimized for a world that was disappearing. And this brings us to perhaps the most critical and least discussed aspect of Megalodon's extinction. Not the cooling oceans, not the changing prey, not the rising competitors, but something internal, something biological, something that made Megalodon uniquely, fatally vulnerable to everything bearing down on it from the outside: its reproduction. The evidence for Megalodon's reproductive strategy comes from a remarkable fossil site. The Bone Valley Formation in central Florida, a phosphate-rich deposit that has yielded thousands of megalodon teeth along with the fossil remains of numerous prey species, contains something extraordinary among its specimens. Teeth from very young megalodon individuals, teeth so small, ranging from 2 to 5 centimeters, that they could only have come from newborn or juvenile animals. These juvenile teeth cluster in specific locations, not distributed randomly across the fossil record, but concentrated in particular shallow coastal environments that paleontologists have interpreted as nursery areas, shallow, warm, protected coastal zones where female megatooths gave birth and where juveniles spent their earliest years, growing in relative safety before venturing into the open ocean. This interpretation was formalized in a 2010 study by Pimento and colleagues published in the journal PLOS ONE, which systematically analyzed the distribution of juvenile megalodon teeth across the Western Atlantic fossil record and confirmed the nursery area hypothesis with strong statistical support. Now consider what the cooling of the Pliocene oceans meant for those nursery areas. Warm, shallow coastal zones were precisely the environments most dramatically affected by the oceanographic changes of the Pliocene. As temperatures dropped and sea levels fluctuated, those critical nursery habitats contracted, shrank, in some regions, disappeared entirely. A species that requires specific coastal environments for successful reproduction and that has a slow reproductive rate typical of large apex predators, cannot sustain population losses when those environments are degraded. Each generation becomes smaller. Each cohort of juveniles faces higher mortality. The population, already stressed by declining food availability and increasing competition, begins to spiral downward. This is not speculation. This is standard conservation biology applied to fossil evidence. And it produces a picture not of sudden catastrophic extinction, but of slow, grinding, inexorable decline. A dynasty fading, not falling. But how fast did it fade? What were the final populations like? Where did the last megatooths swim? That is where the fossil record gets both more precise and more haunting. The shrinking world, mapping the final populations. There is something deeply melancholy about watching a distribution map. Imagine a world map covered in red dots, each dot representing a confirmed megalodon fossil occurrence. In the Miocene, at the peak of megalodon's dominance, those dots cover virtually every coastline on the planet. The Atlantic seaboard of North America, the Mediterranean basin, West Africa, Southern Australia, Japan, New Zealand, the Pacific coast of South America, every major ocean, every major continental shelf, red dots everywhere. Now watch what happens as you move forward through time, into the late Miocene, into the early Pliocene. The dots begin to disappear. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, region by region, the red fades. Higher latitudes go first, the colder margins, the deeper waters, then the mid-latitudes, then even the tropical regions begin to thin. By 3.6 million years ago, the map is almost empty. This is not imagination. This is exactly what Catalina Pimiento and her colleague Charles Clements did in their landmark 2014 study published in the journal PLOS ONE. They compiled and analyzed every confirmed Megalodon fossil occurrence in the global scientific literature, over 300 individual data points spanning more than 20 million years of geological time. They mapped the distribution of those occurrences through time, and they produced something that looks less like a scientific graph and more like a time-lapse of a civilization collapsing. The geographic contraction of Megalodon's range was not random. It followed a pattern, and that pattern tells us something crucial about which populations survived longest and why. The first regions to lose Megalodon were the highest latitudes, the northernmost and southernmost fossil occurrences, from deposits in what is now northern Europe, Japan, and southern South America, disappear from the record earliest, around 5 to 6 million years ago. These were the regions hit first and hardest by the cooling of the Pliocene Ocean. The water temperatures in these areas dropped below the threshold Megalodon apparently required, not just for comfort, but for physiological function. Because Megalodon, despite its size and power, almost certainly had significant thermal constraints. The evidence for this comes from a sophisticated analysis published in 2023 in the journal Nature Communications by a team led by Robert Eagle at the University of California, Los Angeles. Eagle and his colleagues used a cutting-edge geochemical technique called clumped isotope thermometry, applied not to sediment cores, but to Megalodon teeth themselves. The calcium phosphate mineral in shark teeth preserves a chemical signature reflecting the temperature at which the tooth formed inside the shark's body. By analyzing this signature in multiple Megalodon teeth from different geological ages, the team was able to estimate Megalodon's internal body temperature. The results were striking. Megalodon's body temperature appears to have been significantly higher than the surrounding seawater, running approximately 7 degrees Celsius above ambient water temperature. This suggests Megalodon was at least partially endothermic, capable of generating and retaining body heat, much like modern great white sharks and certain tuna species, through a physiological mechanism called regional endothermy. Networks of blood vessels that exchange heat between outgoing warm blood and incoming cold blood, keeping the core body and critical organs warmer than the surrounding water. This is an enormous metabolic advantage in a warm ocean. It allows larger body size, faster swimming speeds, faster digestion and reaction times. But it comes with a brutal cost. Maintaining an elevated body temperature requires enormous caloric. And as the oceans cool, the energetic demands of maintaining that temperature differential between internal body heat and increasingly cold surrounding water become progressively more expensive. A Megalodon in a cooling ocean was not just losing prey. It was burning more calories simply to stay warm while simultaneously finding less food to replace those calories. A metabolic trap closing from both ends. The clumped isotope data, combined with the fossil distribution data from Pimento's range contraction analysis, paints a picture of a species retreating toward warmth. Pulling back from the cold margins, concentrating in the remaining warm water refugia, the tropical and subtropical regions where ocean temperatures remained highest, longest. But even those refugia were shrinking. The Pliocene fossil record of Megalodon shows a concentration of the youngest, latest occurrences in specific geographic clusters. The Western Atlantic, particularly the formations of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. The Eastern Pacific, specifically the deposits of Chile and Peru. The Mediterranean, though Mediterranean occurrences thin out earlier than Atlantic ones, suggesting that semi-enclosed sea cooled faster. and the Indo-Pacific region, where warm water from the equatorial current system maintained suitable temperatures longer than in other areas. These are the last strongholds, the final refugia, the places where the last megatooths made their stand against a world that was becoming inhospitable. And within these refugia, the population was almost certainly structured in ways that made recovery increasingly difficult. Large apex predators naturally exist at low population densities. This is a universal ecological principle. The higher you are in the food web, the less energy is available to support your population, because energy is lost at every trophic level. Modern great white sharks, for all their success as apex predators, exist at densities of perhaps a few individuals per hundreds of kilometers of coastline in even their most productive habitats. Researchers using satellite tagging and genetic population studies have estimated the total global population of great white sharks at somewhere between 1,000 and approximately 3,500 individuals, a number that shocked the public when it was first published in a 2011 study by Barbara Block and colleagues at Stanford University's Hopkins Marine Station. Megalodon, significantly larger and with correspondingly larger caloric requirements, would almost certainly have existed at even lower population densities than modern great whites. The total Pliocene population of Megalodon, even at its height, may have been numbered in the low thousands globally, perhaps significantly fewer. Now apply the pressure of declining prey, shrinking habitat, cooling temperatures, and increasing competition. The mathematics become brutal. Population ecologists use a concept called the minimum viable population, the smallest number of individuals of a species that can sustain a reproducing population indefinitely without collapsing from inbreeding, genetic drift, or random demographic events. For large, slow-reproducing apex predators, that minimum viable population number is typically in the hundreds of individuals at absolute minimum. And most conservation biologists argue for thousands as a safe threshold. As Megalodon's range contracted and its population declined, there came a point, impossible to pinpoint precisely in the fossil record, but real nonetheless, when the global population fell below that threshold. When the remaining individuals were too few, too scattered, too reproductively isolated from each other to sustain the species. At that point, extinction was not a question of if, only when. But the fossil record preserves more than just the geographic contraction. It preserves something subtler, something that speaks to the biological stress the species was experiencing in its final millions of years. Tooth morphology. Megalodon teeth from younger Pliocene deposits, the teeth from the final populations, show measurable differences from Miocene specimens in the same research analyzed by Pimento's team. The teeth are, on average, slightly smaller. The serration patterns show increased variability, and in some specimen collections, researchers have noted a higher frequency of pathological teeth. Teeth with irregular growth patterns, asymmetries, and structural abnormalities that suggest the animals producing them were experiencing nutritional stress or developmental disruption. This is exactly what conservation biologists observe in modern endangered species under population pressure. Genetic diversity drops. Developmental stability decreases. Morphological abnormalities increase. The population begins to show the biological signatures of collapse long before the last individual dies. The teeth themselves were telling the story. And the story they told was one of a species already in its death spiral. Even as individual megatooths continued to swim, continued to hunt, continued to leave their enormous, serrated calling cards in the seafloor sediments of the shrinking warm water refugia. Now zoom in further. past the population level, past the geographic range, down to the level of individual animals in specific locations. The Bone Valley Formation in Florida. This site deserves special attention because it represents one of the richest and most temporally continuous records of Megalodon's presence in the western Atlantic. Phosphate mining operations in Polk County, Florida, have been exposing Miocene and Pliocene fossil beds since the early 20th century. The collections recovered from these operations, housed today at institutions including the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville, contain thousands of megalodon teeth spanning millions of years of geological time. And within that collection, researchers can trace the temporal distribution of specimens with remarkable precision. The youngest Bone Valley megalodon teeth, those from the uppermost Pliocene deposits, are present, but they are rare, dramatically rarer than specimens from older layers, and the juvenile teeth, the nursery area indicators, become particularly scarce in the youngest deposits. This is significant. Remember that the presence of juvenile teeth indicates active reproduction in an area. When juvenile teeth disappear from a location before adult teeth do, it suggests that reproductive activity ceased before the adults themselves vanished. The nursery habitat became unsuitable first. The mothers stopped returning. The juveniles stopped being born in that location, or stopped surviving long enough to leave fossil teeth. And then, eventually, the adults stopped coming too. Not with a roar, not with some final dramatic confrontation, but with a silence, a gradual absence, a species withdrawing from place after place after place, until there were no more places left to withdraw to. The Western Atlantic Refugium held on longest. The data from Pimento's 2019 analysis suggests that the last confirmed megalodon fossils from this region date to approximately 3.6 million years ago, younger than the final occurrences in most other parts of the world. This was the last stronghold, the last place on Earth where Megalodon's population, however diminished, however stressed, however reduced from its Miocene glory, continued to function. And then it did not. The question that remains, the question that sits at the heart of this entire investigation, is what happened in those final years. In that last population, in that last refugium, in what we might call, in the compressed language of geological time, the last 24 hours. What did those final megatooths experience? What was their world like? What were they hunting? What were they competing against? And what, ultimately, was the specific mechanism that pushed the last individuals over the edge from critically endangered to completely extinct? To answer that, we need to go deeper, into the oceanography of the early Pliocene Western Atlantic, into the specific prey communities that were available to the last megatooths, into the competitive pressures they faced from the predator communities that were flourishing around them, into the crime scene itself. The last hunt, what the final megatooths were chasing. Picture the Western Atlantic, 3.8 million years ago, 200,000 years before the last confirmed megalodon fossil will be deposited in the sediment below. The water is cooler than it was in the Miocene, but here, in the subtropical latitudes stretching from what is now the southeastern United States down through the Caribbean and along the northern coast of South America, the ocean is still warm enough, still productive enough, still capable of supporting the last remnant population of the most fearsome predator the ocean has ever produced. But only just. To understand what the last megatooths were hunting, we need to understand what the early Pliocene Western Atlantic actually contained. What prey communities had survived the transition from the warm Miocene world? What was left in the ocean larder for an animal that required, by the best current estimates, somewhere between 300 and 1,000 kilograms of food per day to sustain its massive metabolic demands? That caloric estimate comes from scaling studies based on modern shark feeding rates. A great white shark of approximately 5 meters requires roughly 11 kilograms of blubber-rich prey per day to maintain energy balance. Scaling that requirement to Megalodon's estimated body mass of 50-plus tons, accounting for the non-linear relationship between body size and metabolic rate described by Kleiber's law, produces daily caloric requirements that are staggering by any biological standard. 1,000 kilograms of prey per day represents a conservative upper estimate. Even the lower estimates, around 300 kilograms daily, require Megalodon to make successful large prey kills with a frequency that leaves almost no margin for error. No margin for lean periods. No margin for the kind of prey scarcity that was becoming increasingly common in the cooling Pliocene ocean. So what was available? The Cedotheriid whales, Megalodon's historical staple prey, were in serious decline by the early Pliocene. These small to medium baleen whales, which had been so abundant in the Miocene that their fossils are found in virtually every Miocene marine deposit in the world, were disappearing. A comprehensive analysis published in 2017 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B by Felix Marx at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences and colleagues documented the extinction trajectory of cedotheriids through the late Miocene and Pliocene. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The cedotheriid radiation, the evolutionary diversification that had produced dozens of species and filled the Miocene oceans with small whale prey, was collapsing. By the early Pliocene, only a handful of cedotheriid species survived, and those survivors were themselves already committed to their own eventual extinction. The last cedotheriid whale, Herpetocetus, persisted into the Pliocene, but was gone by approximately 3 million years ago. Its disappearance was almost perfectly synchronized with Megalodon's own extinction. Two species locked in a shared decline, predator and prey, failing together. But cedotheriids were not the only option. The early Pliocene Western Atlantic also contained early relatives of modern baleen whales, the ancestors of today's humpbacks, minkies, and right whales. These proto-mysticetes were larger than cedotheriids in many cases, and they were not yet extinct. Their lineages would survive and diversify through the Pliocene and Pleistocene into the modern era. Could Megalodon hunt them? This is where size and strategy become critical. Modern great whales, adult blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks, are essentially invulnerable to predation by any existing predator. Their size places them beyond the reach of even coordinated killer whale attacks in most circumstances. But juvenile great whales, calves, and yearlings are a different matter entirely. Modern killer whales regularly prey on great whale calves, and Megalodon, with its incomparably greater bite force and body mass, would have been capable of attacking even subadult individuals of larger whale species. But here is the problem. Hunting large, powerful, increasingly rare prey that was itself evolving better anti-predator behaviors in response to exactly the kind of hunting pressure Megalodon exerted, is an escalating energetic gamble. Every failed attack costs calories. Every pursuit that ends without a kill deepens the caloric deficit. And large prey animals, unlike the relatively docile cedotheriids of the Miocene, were increasingly capable of fighting back. The fossil record contains a remarkable piece of evidence on this point. A fossil humpback whale vertebra recovered from Pliocene deposits in Baja California
examined by researchers at the Universidad Autónoma de Baja California Sur, shows healed bite wounds consistent with large shark attack. Healed. The whale survived the attack. It lived long enough for bone to regrow around the wound.
Which means the Megalodon, or whatever large shark made that bite, failed. It attacked. It bit. And it did not kill. A failed hunt, written in bone, preserved for 3 million years. That single specimen encapsulates the challenge facing the last megatooths. Their prey was not helpless. Their prey was large, powerful, capable of escape and even resistance. And hunting such prey, in a colder ocean with reduced productivity, with increasing competition from other predators targeting the same animals, was becoming progressively more costly and less reliable. What about alternative prey? Could Megalodon have shifted its diet in response to the declining availability of its historical prey base? This is a question that touches on one of the deepest uncertainties in Megalodon biology: dietary flexibility. The ability to switch prey types in response to changing availability is a critical survival trait. Modern great white sharks exhibit considerable dietary flexibility. Juveniles feed primarily on fish. Adults shift to marine mammals. Individuals in areas with limited marine mammal availability can sustain themselves on large fish species, including tuna and swordfish. This flexibility is part of what makes great white sharks such successful survivors. Did Megalodon have comparable flexibility? The isotopic evidence is equivocal but suggestive. Nitrogen and carbon isotope ratios preserved in Megalodon teeth, analyzed in studies including a 2012 investigation by Kenshu Shimada and colleagues at DePaul University, published in the journal Historical Biology, indicate that Megalodon consistently fed at the very top of the marine food web. Its isotopic signature clusters firmly in the apex predator range, consistent with a diet dominated by large marine mammals. There is no clear isotopic signal of significant dietary shift, no evidence of megatooths suddenly switching to fish or smaller prey in their final millions of years. Either Megalodon lacked the dietary flexibility to make that shift, or the shift, if it occurred, was insufficient to compensate for the loss of its primary prey base. Or, and this is the interpretation favored by a growing number of paleontologists, Megalodon's sheer body size made meaningful dietary flexibility essentially impossible. You cannot sustain an animal requiring hundreds of kilograms of food daily on a diet of fish. The math does not work. Even tuna, the largest and most energy-rich fish available, would need to be caught in enormous quantities, far greater quantities than an animal of Megalodon's body plan, optimized for pursuing large, slow-moving targets rather than fast, maneuverable fish, could realistically achieve. Megalodon was trapped by its own magnificence. Its size, the trait that had made it invincible for 20 million years, was now an anchor, dragging it down in an ocean that no longer had enough large prey to keep it afloat. But the food supply crisis, devastating as it was not operating alone. Because in those same Western Atlantic waters, in that same early Pliocene ecosystem, something else was happening simultaneously. The competitive pressure was intensifying. Great white sharks were not merely present in the early Pliocene Western Atlantic, they were thriving. The fossil record of this period and region contains a significant increase in great white shark tooth occurrences precisely as Megalodon occurrences decline. This anti-correlated pattern, more great whites as Megalodon fades, is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for competitive displacement in the entire Megalodon extinction story. And the competition was not just for food. It was for the nursery areas. Remember the shallow, warm, protected coastal environments that Megalodon required for reproduction? In the early Pliocene Western Atlantic, those same environments were increasingly utilized by great white shark populations. Great white sharks also use coastal nursery areas for juvenile development. The species were competing not just for adult prey in the open ocean, but for the limited coastal habitats critical to reproductive success. A 2021 analysis by Eva Grasby and colleagues at the University of Toronto examined the spatial overlap between Megalodon nursery area fossil occurrences and early Pliocene great white shark fossil occurrences in the Western Atlantic. Their findings suggested significant geographic overlap. The two species were not segregated into separate coastal zones, but were competing directly for the same limited coastal habitat. For Megalodon, already stressed by prey decline and thermal challenges, this additional pressure on its reproductive refugia may have been the critical additional weight that tipped the balance. But there is one more element of the last hunt that deserves our attention. One more aspect of what the final megatooths were experiencing in those last centuries and millennia before extinction. Something that the fossil record captures not in teeth or bite marks, but in the distribution of other species. The prey was moving. As ocean temperatures in the Western Atlantic fluctuated through the early Pliocene, driven by the intensifying glacial-interglacial cycles that were beginning to characterize the Pliocene climate, the prey communities were not static. Whale migration patterns were shifting. Species were tracking their preferred temperature ranges northward and southward as the climate pulsed. The warm water prey that Megalodon depended on was becoming a moving target in every sense of the phrase. Modern great white sharks handle this challenge through long-distance migration. Satellite-tagged individuals have been tracked crossing entire ocean basins, from South Africa to Australia, from California to Hawaii, covering thousands of kilometers in a single journey. This migratory flexibility allows them to track prey across vast distances and seasonal cycles. Could Megalodon migrate similarly? The fossil evidence suggests Megalodon was capable of occupying a broad geographic range, but the concentration of its fossils in coastal and continental shelf environments, rather than the open ocean, suggests it was more coastally oriented than modern great whites. Its nursery area dependence tied it to specific coastal locations in ways that may have limited its migratory flexibility. An animal that must return to specific coastal nursery areas to reproduce cannot follow its prey indefinitely into open ocean environments. It is anchored, constrained, and in a world where the prey is increasingly mobile and the coastal anchors are increasingly unsuitable, that constraint becomes lethal. The last megatooths were hunting in a world that had reorganized itself against them. The prey was scarcer, more dangerous, and more mobile. The competitors were more numerous and more efficient. The nursery habitats were degraded. The ocean temperatures were marginal and fluctuating. Every hunt was more costly than the last. Every successful kill was rarer than the one before. Every breeding season produced fewer surviving juveniles. And somewhere in those final centuries, in the compressed geological moment we are calling the last 24 hours, the last individual Megalodon made its last hunt. It found prey, or it did not. It fed, or it starved. It survived that day, or it did not. And at some point, in some location we cannot yet precisely identify, in some warm coastal water of the early Pliocene Western Atlantic, the last Megalodon died. And there was no one to replace it. The ocean closed over it. The sediment slowly covered its teeth, and the most fearsome predator that ever lived became. But before we reach that final moment, before we close the case file on this 20-million-year dynasty, we need to confront the most controversial question in the entire Megalodon story. A question that refuses to stay buried. A question that has haunted ocean science for over a century. What if the extinction was not complete? The convergence, when everything went wrong at once. There is a concept in systems theory called a cascade failure. It describes what happens when multiple independent systems, each stressed but individually manageable, fail simultaneously. When the failures compound each other, when the collapse of one system removes the buffer that was holding the next system together. When what looked like a collection of separate, manageable problems reveals itself to be a single, interconnected catastrophe. Cascade failure is what brought down the Titanic. Not the iceberg alone, not the design flaws alone, not the speed alone, but all of them together in sequence, each one eliminating the margin that might have survived the next. Cascade failure is what ended Megalodon. We have spent the last several chapters examining the individual pressures bearing down on the species in its final millions of years. The cooling oceans, the shrinking prey base, the rising competitors, the degraded nursery habitats, the metabolic trap of maintaining endothermy in increasingly cold water. Each of these pressures, examined in isolation, might have been survivable. Large, successful species have weathered individual environmental challenges before. The fossil record is full of species that bent under pressure but did not break. What makes Megalodon's extinction remarkable, and what the latest research is beginning to clarify, is the precise timing with which all of these pressures converged. Not spread across millions of years, but concentrated, intensifying, compounding each other within a geologically narrow window of time that corresponds almost exactly to the Pliocene marine revolution, the sweeping ecological reorganization of the world's oceans between approximately 4 and 3 million years ago. Let us map the convergence precisely. 4 million years ago. The Central American Seaway is in its final stages of closure. Ocean circulation is reorganizing. The Gulf Stream is intensifying. North Atlantic deep water formation is accelerating, pulling cold water down from the surface in the north and driving warm tropical water eastward and northward in a feedback loop that will eventually trigger the first major northern hemisphere glaciation. The ocean is not yet dramatically colder than the Miocene peak, but the trajectory is established and accelerating. Megalodon's range has already contracted from its Miocene maximum. The high-latitude populations are gone. The Mediterranean occurrences are thinning, but the Western Atlantic and Indo-Pacific refugia are still functional, still supporting reproducing populations. The species is stressed but extant. The red dots on Pimento's distribution map are fewer, but they are still there. 3.8 million years ago. The closure of the Central American Seaway is effectively complete. The oceanographic consequences are now fully in play. The thermal gradient between the equator and the poles is steepening. Upwelling patterns along continental margins are intensifying in some regions and collapsing in others. Sea surface temperatures in the subtropical Western Atlantic, Megalodon's last stronghold, are measurably lower than they were 2 million years earlier. The cedotheriid whale decline is now critical. Herpetocetus, the last of the line, is in its final million years. The prey base that supported Megalodon through its entire evolutionary history is in terminal collapse. And the replacement prey, the Protomysticetes, the early ancestors of modern great whales, while present, is increasingly difficult to hunt successfully. These are larger, more powerful animals. They fight back. They escape. The caloric return per hunt is declining even as the caloric cost per hunt is increasing. Great white sharks are now firmly established in the western Atlantic. Their fossil occurrences in this period cluster in precisely the coastal and shelf environments where Megalodon's own occurrences are concentrated. The competition for both adult prey and nursery habitat is direct and sustained. 3.6 million years ago. The threshold. A study published in 2024 in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution by a team including Jeremy McCormick at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology added a new dimension to our understanding of this precise moment. Using zinc isotope analysis of megalodon teeth, a cutting-edge technique that provides information about trophic position with even greater precision than traditional nitrogen isotope methods, McCormick and colleagues found evidence that Megalodon's trophic position was shifting in its final period. The zinc isotope ratios in the youngest Megalodon teeth show values suggesting the animals were feeding at a slightly lower trophic level than their Miocene predecessors. In plain language, the last megatooths were eating smaller, lower-quality prey than their ancestors. Not by choice, by necessity. The large prey was gone or inaccessible. They were taking what they could find. This is the biological signature of a predator in crisis. Modern analogs are instructive. When lion populations in the Serengeti lose access to their preferred prey, zebra and wildebeest, they shift to smaller, less calorie-dense prey like warthogs and smaller antelopes. Their body condition declines. Reproductive success drops. Cub survival rates fall. The population enters a negative feedback loop where poor nutrition produces poor reproductive outcomes, which produce a smaller population, which has even less hunting success, which produces even worse nutrition. The last megatooths were in exactly this loop, eating lower quality prey, producing fewer surviving juveniles, losing individuals faster than new ones could replace them. The population, already tiny by any reasonable estimate, was bleeding out in slow motion. And then, precisely at this moment of maximum vulnerability, the climate delivered its final blow. The intensification of the Pliocene glacial cycles around 3.6 to 3 million years ago produced something the Western Atlantic had not experienced in millions of years: rapid, repeated, dramatic fluctuations in sea surface temperature. Not the slow, gradual cooling of the preceding millions of years, but sharp oscillations. Warm periods followed by cold snaps. Cold periods followed by partial recovery. A thermal roller coaster that prevented any stable ecological equilibrium from establishing itself. For Megalodon's last populations, already operating at the margins of thermal and caloric viability, these oscillations were catastrophic. During cold phases, prey migrated away from the coastal areas Megalodon depended on. Nursery habitats became temporarily unsuitable. Juvenile survival rates collapsed. And when the warm phase returned, briefly, partially, there were fewer adults left to reproduce, fewer juveniles born, fewer survivors into the next cold phase. Each cycle ratcheted the population down another notch, like a one-way valve. Warm phase brought partial recovery. Cold phase brought greater collapse than the previous cold phase. Net result? Inexorable decline. This ratchet mechanism, documented in the paleoclimate record through oxygen isotope analysis of deep-sea sediment cores by researchers at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, provides the most precise mechanistic explanation for why Megalodon's extinction occurred when it did. Not at the coldest point of the Pliocene, not at a single catastrophic moment, but at the cumulative endpoint of repeated thermal stresses that the already depleted population could not absorb. Now add one final element to this convergence, one that is rarely discussed in popular accounts of Megalodon's extinction, but that represents, in the opinion of several leading marine paleontologists, a potentially decisive final factor: competition for juveniles. Adult Megalodon, 15 meters, 50 tons, with a bite force capable of crushing whalebone, had essentially no natural predators. Nothing in the Pliocene Ocean could threaten a healthy, full-grown Megalodon. But juvenile megatooths, newborns, and yearlings of 2 to 4 meters in length were a very different matter. At those sizes, they were vulnerable to the large sharks that were diversifying through the Pliocene, vulnerable to early orca relatives, vulnerable to the same predators that juvenile great white sharks face today. Modern great white shark nurseries are characterized by the relative absence of larger predatory sharks. The juveniles occupy these areas partly because larger predators, including adult great whites, tend to avoid the very shallow coastal environments where the juveniles shelter. This spatial segregation is a critical survival mechanism. But as great white sharks proliferated through the early Pliocene Western Atlantic, establishing their own nursery areas in the same coastal environments Megalodon required, the spatial segregation that protected Megalodon's juveniles may have broken down. Great white sharks of 3 to 4 meters, large enough to pose a serious threat to newborn megatooths, were increasingly present in the exact environments where Megalodon reproduction was concentrated. We cannot observe this directly in the fossil record. We cannot see a great white shark attacking a juvenile Megalodon preserved in stone. But the ecological logic is sound, and the spatial overlap is documented. And the consequence, elevated juvenile mortality in an already stressed population, would have been devastating. A population under pressure can sometimes sustain adult mortality if juvenile survival is high. The young replace the old. The population holds. But when juvenile survival collapses simultaneously with adult nutritional stress, the population has no buffer, no cohort coming up behind the stressed adults to replace them as they die. The age structure of the population inverts. Old animals increasingly malnourished, increasingly rare. Young animals increasingly scarce, increasingly vulnerable. And the middle, the healthy, reproductively active adults that form the core of any viable population, thinning toward nothing. This is what the tooth record from the final Pliocene deposits appears to show. Pimento's analysis of tooth size distribution through time reveals that the youngest Megalodon fossil assemblages are dominated by adult-sized teeth, with juvenile teeth becoming progressively rarer. Not because juveniles were not being born, but because they were not surviving, not leaving teeth in the fossil record, not growing to adulthood. The pipeline was broken. The future of the species was being consumed before it could arrive. Somewhere around 3.6 million years ago, give or take the resolution limits of radiometric dating, the last cohort of juvenile megatooths failed to survive to reproductive age. The last breeding adults, old, malnourished, isolated from each other across the vast distances of the Western Atlantic, failed to produce surviving offspring. And then the adults themselves began to die. One by one, season by season, year by year. Not dramatically, not in some final epic confrontation with the forces that had undone them, just quietly. A failure to find sufficient prey on one hunt, a metabolic deficit that accumulated over weeks and months, a body that had once powered through cold water with effortless dominance, now burning its own muscle mass to maintain core temperature. a predator that had ruled for 20 million years, reduced at the end to simple biological arithmetic. More calories out than in, every single day, until the debt could no longer be serviced. The last Megalodon did not go out fighting. It went out hungry. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting truth in this entire investigation, that the most powerful predator the ocean ever produced, an animal of such physical magnificence that it strains the imagination, was not defeated by something stronger. It was defeated by something as mundane as an empty stomach and a cold ocean. But there is one question we still have not answered, one that has persisted for over a century, one that some people, not all of them conspiracy theorists or science fiction writers, take seriously. What if it did not end there? What if the last tooth in the sediment was not actually the last tooth? The ghost in the deep. Could Megalodon still exist? In 1978, a research vessel operating in the Pacific Ocean dragged a deep-sea trawl net up from approximately 3,000 meters below the surface. Among the sediment and organisms recovered from the net were 2 Megalodon teeth. Nothing unusual about that. Megalodon teeth are found on ocean floors worldwide. They are among the most commonly recovered large fossils from deep-sea dredging operations. What made these teeth remarkable was their condition. They were not heavily mineralized, not the dark, dense, almost stone-like fossils typical of specimens millions of years old. They were relatively fresh-looking, light in color, less consolidated than typical fossil material. When researchers at the Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory analyzed the manganese oxide coating on these teeth, manganese accumulates on ocean floor objects at a known, measurable rate. They produced an estimate that sent a shock wave through certain scientific circles. The coating suggested the teeth were perhaps 11,000 years old. Some interpretations pushed that estimate even lower, perhaps only 10,000 years old, possibly younger. If accurate, that would place living megatooths not in the Pliocene, not 3.6 million years ago, but in the very recent geological past, potentially overlapping with human civilization. This is the seed of one of the most persistent and emotionally compelling questions in all of popular science. Is Megalodon still out there? Somewhere in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, in the hadal zones and abyssal plains that remain among the least explored environments on Earth? Could the last descendants of Otodus Megalodon have survived? Hidden from our nets, our sonar, our cameras, our satellites? It is a question that has sold millions of books, driven enormous movie box office receipts, and generated a seemingly inexhaustible supply of internet speculation. And it deserves a serious, evidence-based answer. Let us start with the manganese dating evidence, because it falls apart under scrutiny almost immediately. Manganese oxide accretion rates on the deep ocean floor are not constant. They vary enormously depending on local geochemical conditions, the chemistry of the overlying water column, sedimentation rates, biological activity, hydrothermal. The accretion rates used to produce those 11,000-year estimates were based on average values derived from limited sampling. Applied to specific teeth in specific locations with potentially very different local conditions, those rates could be wildly inaccurate. A 2023 reanalysis of the original Lamont Doherty data by Philip Mata and colleagues at the University of South Florida concluded that the manganese dating methodology used on those teeth was insufficiently precise to distinguish between a 10,000-year-old specimen and a 3-million-year-old specimen deposited in a geochemically unusual environment. The teeth were almost certainly ancient fossils.
Their apparently fresh condition was an artifact of their specific deep-sea depositional environment, conditions that can preserve organic material in ways that mimic much younger ages. So the manganese evidence evaporates. But the question remains. Could Megalodon survive in the deep ocean, unknown to science? To answer this properly, we need to move away from anecdote and toward biology. Because the question of whether Megalodon could exist undetected is not primarily a question about how well we have explored the oceans. It is a question about Megalodon's biology, about what the animal needed to survive, and whether the deep ocean could possibly provide it. Start with physiology. We established in an earlier chapter that Megalodon was at least partially endothermic, capable of maintaining body temperatures significantly above ambient water temperature. This is an advantage in warm surface waters. In the deep ocean, where water temperatures drop to between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius at abyssal depths, maintaining that temperature differential would require an absolutely staggering caloric input. The metabolic cost of endothermy increases dramatically as the temperature differential between body and environment grows.
An animal trying to maintain a body temperature of perhaps 25 to 30 degrees Celsius in water of 2 degrees would need to eat almost continuously just to maintain thermal homeostasis. And what would it eat? This is the central biological impossibility of the deep ocean Megalodon hypothesis. Megalodon was a predator of large marine mammals, whales, sirenians, large cetaceans. These animals live at the ocean's surface and in the upper water column. They are air breathers. They cannot survive at abyssal depths. The deep ocean contains no whale prey. It contains giant squid, deep sea fish, and various invertebrates, none of which represent viable prey for an animal of Megalodon's size and biological requirements. A 15-meter, 50-ton shark built to hunt large marine mammals cannot sustain itself in an environment devoid of large marine mammals. The physics are non-negotiable. But what about a shallower interpretation of the survival hypothesis? Not the abyssal deep, but the mesopelagic zone, the twilight zone, depths of 200 to 1,000 meters, where some large marine life does exist, where sperm whales dive, where giant squid reach enormous sizes. Could a reduced population of Megalodon persist there, undetected? Still no. And for a reason that goes beyond prey availability, population viability. Any surviving Megalodon population, to be biologically meaningful, to actually constitute a surviving species rather than a few isolated individuals eking out a doomed existence, would need to number in the hundreds at absolute minimum. More realistically, in the thousands. A viable reproducing population of an apex predator the size of Megalodon would require an enormous prey base to support it, and an enormous prey base of large marine mammals cannot exist invisibly. Whale populations are monitored, their distributions are tracked, their numbers are estimated. A prey community large enough to support even a minimal viable Megalodon population would be detectable through its impact on the whale and large cetacean populations we monitor today. There is no such impact. Whale populations, recovering since the end of commercial whaling, show no evidence of predation pressure from an unknown megapredator, no anomalous mortality, no unexplained disappearances inconsistent with known predators, no acoustic or sonar signatures consistent with an unidentified large shark. Furthermore, and this point cannot be overstated, we have never once photographed, filmed, or physically recovered any evidence of a living Megalodon. Not a tooth, not a tissue sample, not a fin photographed at the surface, not a sonar return inconsistent with known species. Consider what we have documented from the deep ocean in recent decades. Species that were considered mythological, the giant squid, Architeuthis dux, were first photographed alive in 2004 by Japanese researchers Tsunemi Kubodera and Kiyoshi Mori, publishing in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. The colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthis hamiltonii, larger than the giant squid and previously known only from partial specimens, has been recovered and examined. The megamouth shark, Megachasma pelagios, a large filter-feeding shark reaching 5 meters in length, was entirely unknown to science until 1976, when a specimen was accidentally captured off Hawaii. These discoveries are cited constantly by Megalodon survival proponents as evidence that large unknown creatures can persist undetected in the oceans. But notice something critical about each of these examples. The giant squid lives at depth and rarely comes to the surface, yet its presence was inferred for decades from physical evidence. Tentacles recovered in sperm whale stomachs, circular sucker scars on sperm whale skin, physical traces in the ecosystem even before direct observation. The megamouth shark, discovered in 1976, has since been observed and documented over 200 times. It left physical traces. Its existence was confirmed rapidly once attention was directed toward it. A surviving megalodon population would leave vastly more physical evidence than a 5-meter filter feeder or a deep-dwelling squid. Megalodon teeth fall out continuously. Sharks shed thousands of teeth over a lifetime. Fresh megalodon teeth would be recovered regularly in nets, on beaches, in deep-sea sediment cores. Whale carcasses bearing fresh megalodon bite marks would wash ashore. Megalodon, as a partially endothermic large shark, would likely need to visit surface waters periodically, as great white sharks do. It would be detected by sonar, by satellite tags on prey species, by the cameras now deployed on thousands of ocean monitoring buoys worldwide. None of this evidence exists. The scientific consensus is clear and is not seriously contested within the paleontological community. Megalodon is extinct. The last confirmed fossil occurrence dates to approximately 3.6 million years ago. There is no credible physical evidence for survival beyond that date. But dismissing the survival hypothesis does not mean dismissing the emotional impulse behind it. And here it is worth pausing, worth being honest about why this question persists, why it refuses to die even in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence. Because Megalodon's extinction represents something that disturbs us at a deep, perhaps primal level. We are accustomed to thinking of extinction as something that happens to the weak, to the small, to the poorly adapted. Dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid, an external catastrophe so overwhelming that no adaptation could have saved them. Dodo birds were killed by human hunting, a cautionary tale about human destructiveness. The woolly mammoth. Climate change and hunting combined to overwhelm a magnificent but numerically limited species. But Megalodon was not weak. It was not small. It was not poorly adapted. For 20 million years, it was the most perfectly adapted large predator on the planet. And it still died. Replaced not by something stronger, not by something more magnificent, but by a confluence of mundane environmental changes and the quiet, relentless competition of smaller, more flexible, more calorie-efficient rivals. If Megalodon can go extinct, if 20 million years of evolutionary perfection provides no guarantee of survival, then what does that say about permanence, about invulnerability, about the reliability of dominance? It says what the fossil record has been saying for 600 million years of animal life on this planet, that nothing is permanent, that every dynasty ends, that the most terrifying thing about extinction is not that it comes for the weak, but that it comes for everyone, eventually, given sufficient time and sufficient change. That is what the Megalodon myth is really about, not the shark. The idea that something so powerful could simply be gone. And that is why the question persists, not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative, accepting that Megalodon is truly, completely, permanently gone, requires accepting something about the nature of existence that is genuinely difficult to sit with. The ocean is vast, the darkness is deep, and the human mind, confronted with a loss of that magnitude, reaches instinctively for hope. We can honor that impulse, we can understand it, and we can still follow the evidence where it leads. Megalodon is gone, but what it leaves behind, what its extinction means, what we can learn from it, what echoes of its existence still shape the oceans we swim in today, that is not gone at all. That is where we turn now, to the final question. Not where Megalodon went, but what the world looks like in its absence, and what that absence is still costing us. The empty throne. What the world lost when Megalodon died. There is a concept in ecology called a trophic cascade. It describes the ripple effect that moves through an entire ecosystem when an apex predator disappears. Not just the obvious consequence, the prey species losing their primary predator, but the second-order effects, the third-order effects, the unexpected, far-reaching, sometimes counterintuitive consequences that propagate through every level of the food web when the animal at the very top is suddenly absent. We have a modern example, a famous one, and it happened not in the ocean, but in a single national park in the American Northwest, and it changed how ecologists think about apex predators forever. In 1995, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park after a 70-year absence. The immediate effect was predictable. Elk populations, which had grown unchecked during the wolfless decades, began to decline. Hunting pressure returned. But then something unexpected happened, something that went far beyond elk numbers. The elk changed their behavior. Under predation pressure, they stopped grazing in the open valleys and riverbanks where wolves could easily ambush them. They moved to higher ground. They spent less time in the riparian zones, the river edges and stream banks. And in their absence from those zones, the vegetation exploded. Willows grew, aspens recovered, riverbank plants stabilized the soil. The rivers themselves changed. Their banks strengthened, their courses stabilized. Their water ran cleaner and clearer. Beaver populations recovered, attracted by the returning willows. Beaver dams created wetlands. Wetlands supported fish. Fish supported eagles and bears and otters. The wolves had changed the rivers. Not directly, not by touching the rivers, but through a cascade of ecological consequences that radiated outward from their return to the top of the food web. Ecologists call this a trophic cascade. And they call the specific mechanism, the change in prey behavior driven by predation fear, rather than just predation itself, the landscape of fear. Now, scale this concept to the ocean. Scale it to the disappearance not of a single wolf pack from a single national park, but of the largest apex predator in the history of the ocean, from every ocean on the planet, simultaneously. What happened to the marine ecosystem when Megalodon's throne went empty? The honest scientific answer is that we do not know with certainty. The Pliocene Ocean is not Yellowstone. We cannot tag and track Pliocene whales. We cannot measure Pliocene vegetation recovery. The fossil record gives us snapshots, species present or absent, morphologies changing or stable, distributions shifting. But it does not give us the behavioral and ecological resolution of a modern field study. But what the fossil record does show, combined with what we know from modern marine ecology and the Yellowstone analogy, is deeply suggestive. Start with the whales. The period immediately following Megalodon's extinction corresponds to one of the most dramatic diversification events in the history of baleen whales. The modern Mystacete whales, blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks, right whales, bowheads, all underwent significant evolutionary radiation through the Pliocene and Pleistocene. Body sizes increased dramatically. The blue whale, the largest animal that has ever existed on this planet, reaching 30 meters in length and 170 tons, evolved and reached its maximum size during exactly this period. Is this a coincidence? Or is there a causal connection? A 2017 study published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B by Graham Slater at the University of Chicago and colleagues used evolutionary modeling to examine the timing and drivers of body size evolution in baleen whales. Their analysis found that the rapid increase in maximum body size among mystacetes was not driven by gradual adaptation to feeding efficiency or climate alone. The timing of the size increase corresponded strongly with the disappearance of large predators capable of threatening adult whales. In other words, whales got bigger because it became safe to be big. When Megalodon was present, extreme large body size in whales carried risks as well as benefits. A whale large enough to be invulnerable to Megalodon attack, something in the range of 15 to 20 meters, gained protection. But the energetic cost of growing to that size had to be weighed against the predation risk during the juvenile years, when the whale was still small enough to be a viable target. Natural selection maintained a balance. Most whale lineages did not evolve to their maximum possible size because the predation pressure from Megalodon made the juvenile growth period too costly and too risky. Remove Megalodon, remove the predation pressure, and suddenly the evolutionary brake on maximum body size is released. Whales can afford to invest in extreme size because the juvenile predation risk, the cost that previously kept that investment from paying off, is gone. The blue whale is, in a very real biological sense, a creature made possible by Megalodon's extinction. This is one of the most remarkable consequences of the trophic cascade. The disappearance of one species created the ecological and evolutionary conditions for the emergence of another, the largest animal that has ever lived. But the cascade did not stop with body size evolution. Consider whale behavior. Modern baleen whales are, by the standards of large mammals, remarkably bold in their use of surface waters. Humpbacks breach dramatically, launching their 40-ton bodies entirely out of the water. Blue whales feed at the surface in vast congregations when krill blooms permit. Right whales, among the slowest and most surface-oriented of all large whales, spend enormous amounts of time logging at the surface, their massive black bodies exposed and apparently unconcerned. This behavior would have been suicidal in a Megalodon-patrolled ocean. A right whale logging at the surface, slow, inattentive, presenting its vulnerable flanks to the open water, would have been precisely the kind of prey Megalodon's ambush hunting strategy was optimized to exploit. The surface-oriented feeding behaviors of modern baleen whales, their relative lack of anti-predator vigilance at the surface, their tendency to congregate in predictable locations, all of these behaviors suggest a species that evolved in the absence of a truly terrifying apex predator. The landscape of fear in the modern ocean, as it pertains to large baleen whales, is shaped primarily by killer whales. And killer whales, for all their intelligence and cooperative hunting ability, pose a realistic threat only to calves and occasionally to weakened or isolated adults of the largest species. The existential dread that Megalodon must have created, a predator capable of killing any whale at any size at any time, is absent from the modern ocean. And its absence has shaped whale behavior in ways that are visible to any researcher who studies these animals today. But here is where the trophic cascade becomes genuinely complex and genuinely troubling. Because the ocean that Megalodon's absence created, the ocean with giant whales, surface-feeding baleen whales, dramatically increased cetacean diversity and abundance, is also the ocean that humans encountered when we first spread across coastlines and put boats on the water. The ocean we then proceeded to devastate through 2 centuries of industrial whaling. And here the story takes a turn that is not about the past at all, but about right now. The great whale populations that evolved in Megalodon's absence, the blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks, right whales, were present in the pre-industrial ocean in numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend today. Before commercial whaling, the global blue whale population is estimated by researchers at the International Whaling Commission to have numbered somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 individuals. Today, after decades of industrial slaughter, the global blue whale population stands at approximately 10,000 to 25,000, less than 10% of its pre-whaling numbers. The whaling industry did in 2 centuries what Megalodon's extinction freed the ocean from doing over millions of years. It removed the pressure from the top of the food web, but in reverse. Not a predator disappearing and releasing its prey, but a prey species being catastrophically reduced, and the consequences cascading downward through the food web in exactly the opposite direction. Because whales are not just prey, they are ecosystem engineers. The research on whale ecological function has exploded in the last 2 decades. What it has revealed is staggering. Whales, through their feeding, their migration, their excretion, and ultimately their death, play roles in ocean ecosystem function that were entirely unsuspected a generation ago. Whale feces, an unglamorous topic, but a critical one. Large whales feed at depth and defecate at the surface, a behavior that oceanographers call the whale pump. Their excretion releases enormous quantities of nitrogen and iron, key limiting nutrients for phytoplankton growth, into the sunlit surface waters where phytoplankton can use them. A single blue whale defecating at the surface releases more biologically available iron in one event than some entire sections of the Southern Ocean receive from other sources in a month. Phytoplankton, the microscopic photosynthesizing organisms that form the base of the marine food web, are also responsible for producing approximately 50% of all the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. And they are also responsible for sequestering approximately 30% of all the carbon dioxide that human industrial activity produces each year. The whale pump, whale feeding, diving, excreting, drives phytoplankton productivity in ways that are now understood to be globally significant for carbon sequestration and atmospheric oxygen production. A 2010 study published in the journal PLOS ONE by Joe Roman at the University of Vermont and James McCarthy at Harvard University calculated that the restoration of great whale populations to their pre-whaling levels could increase ocean productivity, measured in phytoplankton carbon fixation, by a factor that would remove tens of millions of tons of additional carbon from the atmosphere annually. The whales are not just animals. They are carbon pumps, atmospheric regulators, ocean fertilizers, and they exist in their current form,
as giant, surface-oriented, nutrient-cycling ecosystem engineers, because Megalodon is gone. Which raises a question that sits at the uncomfortable intersection of paleontology, ecology, and the climate crisis we are currently living.
If Megalodon had not gone extinct, if somehow the cascade of Pliocene pressures had been less severe, if the species had found a way to persist, what would the ocean look like today? Would whale body sizes have remained smaller, constrained by predation pressure? Would whale populations have been kept at lower densities by predation, limiting their role as nutrient cyclers? Would the great whale pump, this biological mechanism that helps regulate Earth's climate, have developed at all? We cannot answer these questions with certainty. Counterfactual ecology is inherently speculative, but the questions themselves illuminate something profound about how interconnected everything is, about how the extinction of a single species, even a species that lived 3.6 million years ago, can echo through time in ways that shape the world we inhabit today. Megalodon's absence is not just a historical fact. It is a structural feature of the modern ocean. And there is one final echo worth considering. We are, right now, in the middle of our own mass extinction event, the sixth mass extinction in Earth's history, driven not by volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts or glacial cycles, but by human activity, habitat destruction, climate change, pollution, overfishing. And we are losing apex marine predators at a rate that has no precedent in the post-Megalodon ocean. Shark populations globally have declined by over 70% in the last 50 years. According to a 2021 study published in the journal Nature by Nathan Pacaro at Simon Fraser University and colleagues, the most comprehensive analysis of global shark and ray population trends ever conducted, the abundance of oceanic sharks and rays has fallen by 71% since 1970. The primary driver is overfishing, direct harvest, and bycatch. Great white sharks, oceanic white-tip sharks, hammerheads, thresher sharks, bull sharks, all in severe decline. All classified as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. We are, in real time, removing apex predators from the ocean, and we have 3.6 million years of evidence, written in fossil teeth and ocean sediment cores and isotope ratios and whale body size distributions, telling us exactly what happens to an ocean when its apex predators disappear. The consequences cascade. They compound. They produce changes at every level of the food web that no one fully predicted and no one can fully reverse once they are set in motion. Megalodon's extinction was not caused by humans. We were not there. We played no role in the Pliocene cooling, the prey decline, the competitive displacement. The extinction of the ocean's greatest predator was a purely natural event, the inevitable outcome of a world changing faster than a species could adapt. But the lesson it offers about the fragility of apex predator populations, about the cascade consequences of losing the animal at the top of the food web, about the way that environmental change and competition and reproductive stress can compound into extinction even for the most dominant species in the history of an ecosystem. That lesson is not historical. It is urgent. It is about right now. It is about the choices being made today. In fishing fleets and coastal development decisions and climate policy and marine protected area legislation, about whether we are going to allow the apex predators of our own ocean, animals far more vulnerable than Megalodon, with far smaller populations and far less evolutionary resilience, to follow the same trajectory. Megalodon ruled for 20 million years. It was brought down by a convergence of forces it could not overcome. It left an empty throne that reshaped the ocean in ways still visible today. We do not get to claim ignorance about what empty thrones cost. The fossil record is too clear. The evidence is too complete. The lesson is written in 3.6 million years of silence. In the absence of those enormous serrated teeth from the seafloor sediments of a world that moved on without them. The question is not what killed Megalodon. The question is what we are going to do with what its death taught us. And that question, unlike the mystery of the ocean's greatest predator, does not belong to the past. It belongs to us, right now, in the choices we make about the ocean we still have. Think about that the next time you stand at the edge of the water. The next time you look out at the surface of the sea and wonder what moves beneath it. Something extraordinary is down there. Something worth protecting. Something that, if the history of Otodus Megalodon teaches us anything at all, is more fragile than it looks, and more irreplaceable than we can possibly imagine. If this investigation raised questions for you about Megalodon, about ocean ecology, about the extinctions happening right now, leave them in the comments below. Every question is worth asking. Every mystery is worth pursuing. That is what we do here. See you in the deep. Megalodon teaches us anything at all is more fragile than it looks, and more irreplaceable than we can possibly imagine. If this investigation raised questions for you about Megalodon, about ocean ecology, about the extinctions happening right now, leave them in the comments below. Every question is worth asking. Every mystery is worth pursuing. That is what we do here. See you in the deep.